Hi guys, I'm here to explain our Great Depression and New Deal notes. This is from chapter 15 in our Northern Lights textbook. Remember, as you're watching the video, you can always pause it to write down your notes, and then there's also the questions to do at the end. You can get your note sheet from Schoology. So what you need to write down is in red, but we need to look at and read everything that is on the slides. Like I said, you need to read and look at all the pictures. And then make sure you upload your note sheet into Schoology when you're done so you can get graded for it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Jazz Age. So the first thing you need to write down is here, number one. After World War I, America was one of the richest countries in the world, and many people enjoyed their lives with more money, better food, new technologies, and parties. Let's say that again. After World War I, America was one of the richest countries in the world, and many people enjoyed their lives with more money, better food, new technologies, and parties. This time period is called the Jazz Age because of the swinging, jazz music, and dancing that people did at parties and at the hidden bars. So Prohibition made alcohol illegal at this time, but many Americans drank at parties anyways. And F. Scott Fitzgerald is a famous Minnesotan-born or St. Paul-born author who often wrote books about the Jazz Age, and they took place in the Jazz Age. So we look at the pictures here. So here you can see people, they're holding up bottles. Looks like they're at a bar. This is the swinging jazz dancing that was happening, and these outfits were very common back then. Here is a jazz band, and this is F. Scott Fitzgerald. So, one famous Minnesotan. Wilbur Fauché was a famous Minnesotan during the 1920s for buying up small companies and then selling stock in the stock market. Fauché built a skyscraper in downtown Minneapolis that was one of the tallest and most important buildings in America until 2 months later when the Great Depression hit. Fun fact, you can still stay at, this is now a hotel that you can stay at. So number two, what you need to write down, like many investors, Fauché lost all of his money and his building stayed empty for years during the Great Depression. So let's think about what's going on in history. We just studied World War I. World War I ended in 1919. So when the 1920s hit, people were dancing, celebrating like we saw on the last slide, right? And things were going well for a while. But then when the Great Depression hit, which is what we're learning about right now, people lost their money, right? Businesses, like buildings, stayed empty for years, okay? So before the crash happened, before people lost money, it was, this is what was happening before the crash. So after World War I, before the crash happened. So some Minnesota women's groups led the charge for making alcohol illegal, creating a law called Prohibition. So Prohibition is one of our vocab words. That is when alcohol was illegal. The third thing you need to write down, during the 1920s, many Minnesotans enjoyed the Jazz Age. That's the dancing, right? And businessmen made money off the stock market. Remember, stock market's another one of our vocab words. And many people ignored the prohibition in hidden bars. So people still went to bars, but they had to do it in hiding, right? So let's read that again. This is what you need to be writing down. During the 1920s, many Minnesotans enjoyed the Jazz Age. Businessmen made money off the stock market, and people ignored prohibition in hidden bars. Most farmers struggled to make money selling wheat, so they switched to milking cows instead. And by the end of the 1920s, many farmers were struggling to make money because of low prices and high demand for food. So we can see that farmers were struggling. So before, a lot of farmers were growing wheat, which is used to make bread, noodles, stuff like that. So they're struggling to make money. So they stopped that and they switched to milking their cows and then selling the milk. But by the end of the 20s, they were still struggling to make money at all. So prices were really low. There was a high demand for food. So This caused a lot of problems. So here you can see cows getting milked. This is a picture that says lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. So it's a poster about prohibition and how you should not drink alcohol. And here's a picture of a hidden bar. So when the crash happened, that happened in 1929, the stock market crashed. Many investors are the people who put money into a business to try later to make money back. So they give money to a businessman who uses that money to start a business, and then later the investor gets the money back once the business starts doing well. So many investors and businesses lost all their money, right? So they put money into businesses hoping, like saying that they'll get it back, but they never did. So what you need to write down is the Jazz Age ended very quickly, and nearly 25% of all Americans lost their jobs, and many people struggled to pay their rent and feed their families. Let's read that again. The Jazz Age ended very quickly. Nearly 25% of Americans lost their jobs, and many people struggled to pay their rent and feed their families. So the World War I ended in 1919, and we see here that the crash happened in 1929. So the Jazz Age, when we had the parties and people celebrating, people eating well and making money in the stock market, that only lasted 10 years, so it ended quickly. And then when it crashed, 25% of people lost their jobs, and many people then, when they lost their jobs, struggled to pay rent and then buy food to feed their families. So the period of time after the crash is called the Great Depression. So we went from the time period of World War I to the Jazz Age, now into the Great Depression, and this Great Depression, it also lasted almost 10 years. So if you look at this picture, this guy has a sign on his car and says $100 will buy this car, must have cash, lost all money in the stock market. So he's an investor, he's dressed up nicely like a nice businessman, has a nice car for the time, but now he's lost all his money. So he's selling his car just for $100 just to try to get something. Here is a newspaper from California, and it says billions lost as stock market or as stocks crash. So billions of dollars are lost because of the stock crash. Okay. So after the crash, this caused a job crisis. So since businesses lost a lot of money, they stopped paying their employees or fired many workers. So since the businesses had no money, they couldn't afford to have employees, so they had to fire them or just they stopped paying them. And a lot of Black and Native American people were typically the first to be fired and the last to be hired for new jobs. So number 5 says people who were in need went to places that provided welfare, which is money and necessary goods like food, blankets, and clothing. So let's read that again. People who were in need went to places that provided welfare or money or goods that they needed, like food, blankets, and clothing. This is something we still have today, right? We have different places that people can go that provides them with money or food, clothes, blankets, things that they need to survive when they can't pay for it themselves. Next, it says people who could not pay rent had to have their homes taken away. Apartment renters were kicked out, and homeowners lost their houses to the bank, and that's called a foreclosure. So not only do we have a job crisis, right? Now people, since they have a job crisis, they can't buy food, right? They can't buy clothes or blankets, and now they don't have a place to live. So people are kicked out of their apartments, or people who owned a home, they had their houses taken away by the bank because they couldn't pay the bank anymore to have that house. So here's a guy holding a sign that says, "Work is what I want and not charity. Who will help me? Get a job, 7 years in Detroit, no money, sent away, furnished, best of references," right? And then has his phone number. So it's a guy begging for a job. He doesn't want to go get supply, like money or charity, as he called it, from somewhere else. He just wants to have a job, right? But there's no jobs happening because businesses don't have the money, right? So here it says free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed. So here's a big line of people waiting just to get some basic things. So after the crash happened, we get a new president, with a New Deal. So people were struggling to live, right? And they wanted change, right? No one wanted to stay in this time where they had no money, no food, no place to live, right? So we voted for a new president. His name is, we call him FDR because his name is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay, so we talked about him on your vocab sheet, right? So instead of writing out his really long name, people just say FDR. And so he promised a new deal for the American people, right? And that's how he won the presidency. So number 6, when you need to write down, in FDR's first 100 days in office, he created the New Deal of social programs that help people stay in their homes, stay fed during the Great Depression. Say it again. In FDR's first 100 days in office, so 100 days is like 3 months and 1 week. Okay, so he did this all in about 3 months. He created a new program that he called the New Deal of social programs that help people stay in their homes and stay fed during the Great Depression, right? And FDR, he was famous for calming the Americans down during radio broadcasts. So here's a picture of him. And so he got on the radio and would just talk to the American people over the radio, and people tuned in and listened to him, and he calmed them down, right? This is a time where a lot of people were panicking, a lot of people were overwhelmed and scared, right? A lot of them didn't have places to live, they didn't have jobs, they didn't have food, so he calmed them down. So those are our notes. Now we have some questions that you guys need to do. Do not write down these questions, right? You need to answer them. So question number 1 says, do you think that it's fair that when the richest people lost all their money, all Americans suffer? Why or why not? Do you think it's fair that when the richest people lose a lot of money, all Americans suffer? Why or why not? Right? So what started all of this happening, what started the Great Depression, was that the rich people who bought stocks in the stock market, the stock market crashed, so they lost all their money, which caused this whole big thing to happen, right? That caused businesses to suffer, which meant people couldn't have jobs, which meant people couldn't have food, houses, right? All those things happened. So it all started because the richest people lost a lot of money. And then everyone suffered. Is that fair? Right? What do you think? So it is fair because, or it is not fair because. Question number 2. Can you make any connections between the Great Depression and the current coronavirus economic crisis? Right? So what do you think that, as we were going through the notes, what reminds you of what's happening now? Right? Think about what's maybe the same between the Great Depression and current situation with the coronavirus, right? Think about how people are losing their jobs, issues with food and school and housing, right? So what can you make a connection, right? The Great Depression reminds me of blank that's happening now, right? Think what's going the same. So now for our third question. So you need to predict. What do you think will happen next in American history? Will life get better or worse for Americans? So what do you think will happen next in American history? Will life get better or worse for Americans? Okay. So I think blank will happen next, and I think life will get blank for Americans. Okay. What do you think? What's going to happen next? Do you think we said in our notes the Great Depression lasted for 10 years. So what happens next? So if you have any questions with the notes or the questions, email Mr. Jimmy or Miss Linnea. Good luck, guys.